I direct your attention to the Gospel of Mark in your New Testament. We'll be looking at the final few verses in the second chapter and then into the third chapter through the sixth verse. Jesus is again going to be challenged essentially on the issue of legalism. The issue of legalism. Very much like he was last Sunday as we looked at the issue of fasting. What should we and should we not be doing in regard to fasting? So I'll begin in the 23rd verse of Mark 2. Hear the word of the Lord. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." Listen, as the reading of this portion of God's holy and inerrant word, legalism. They're trying to corner Jesus, see if they can't accuse him successfully of not being as legalistic as these Pharisees are. Listen to this about legalism. Over in Sardinia, Italy, a fellow by the name of Mario Mamelli went to the city hall for a new identity card. He was told that he had been officially dead for 19 years and that by remaining alive, he was breaking the law. Now that's legalism. No, you're dead. No, I'm alive. No, you're breaking the law. How can I be breaking the law? And on and on. You see, legalism can crop up anywhere, as well as a laissez-faire attitude of I don't care at all what I do. Even in relation to the Sabbath, there can be legalistic ritual. There can be laissez-faire attitudes. And Jesus tells us what we need to know about our practices on Sunday, on the New Covenant day of the Sabbath. You see, Christians should view the Sabbath as a perpetual, ongoing opportunity granted to them by God to worship the Lord. Of course, worship the Lord. Be renewed in their faith and to serve those around them. That's precisely what Jesus is espousing. That's what he's promoting, that we have that kind of view, not this legalistic type of ritualistic view as the Pharisees had. So Jesus' growing nemesis, these Pharisees, they're seizing on another opportunity to try to discredit and scandalize Christ. That is their deepest, darkest desire. They want to shame Christ. They want to embarrass him. They want to debunk him. They want to be able to say he's a fraud. And so they're attacking him with issues concerning the law. And this morning, the Sabbath. This time, the issue is Jesus and his practices on the Sabbath. What is Jesus doing on Saturday, which was the day of the Sabbath in the Old Covenant? Well, what is God's express will for his people concerning the Sabbath? In both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, well, I read from Deuteronomy earlier in the service. I'm going to read a portion from Exodus chapter 20, the same thing, but I would beg you to hear it again. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. That's what God says to us about our activities on the Sabbath day. That's a day set apart for God. It's a day set apart wherein we would cease as much as we possibly can from work. Now, I know there are types of work that I believe certainly need to be happening. If my house catches on fire this afternoon, I want the Valdosta Fire Department there quickly. So as much as is possible, a cessation from our normal work, rest, worship, renewal. These are the kinds of things that God is saying to us. And nothing has changed in that regard. Not at all. And so Jesus raises 3 issues relating to the Sabbath as he has asked these 2 questions. Why are you letting your disciples munch on the grain in the field as they're walking through? And why in the world would you heal a man who has a withered arm and do that on the Sabbath? Why would you do that? Well, Jesus is going to speak to us in his answers about the necessities of life over and against Sabbath ritual. He's going to speak to us about works of mercy versus Sabbath ritual. And then finally, and most importantly, and I will seek to impress this upon you, Sabbath purpose versus Sabbath ritual. If we could only, by God's grace, understand the purpose, the design of the Sabbath day, perhaps we would not struggle so often with what we are or are not doing on the Sabbath day. So to understand these 3 issues is to know what we are really to be doing on the Sabbath. So let's begin by talking about the necessities of life versus Sabbath ritual. Verses 23 through 26. The incident is clearly portrayed. Jesus and his disciples are walking along. Now we know that ancient Israel was an agrarian economy. People were growing grain and all varieties of things all over the land. And so they start picking some grain on the Sabbath day because they're hungry. And the question comes, oh, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Oh, my gosh. They are harvesting crops. They are assuming on the Sabbath. And the implication is simply that Jesus is condoning this outright transgression of the 4th commandment. Jesus is out there overseeing the harvest of crops on the Sabbath. Well, was the 4th commandment really being broken? Was it? Well, let me read from Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23 says, if you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain. So you could pick the grain, you could consume the grain, but don't go harvest your neighbor's field. So that was the law. The disciples were not in violation of biblical law, but the Pharisees, let me tell you what they had done. Through the years, they had developed what they called the 39 laws of the Sabbath. The 39 laws of the Sabbath. Not content with things in Exodus and Deuteronomy and so forth, they had to have extra biblical restrictions relating to the Sabbath, and plucking grain was one of them. He said no plucking of grain, even though it is clearly permitted by Scriptures. The Pharisees, they loved man-made laws and traditions that they could elevate above the revealed will of God. So how does Jesus justify the practices of his disciples on the Sabbath? He doesn't just blow off this question, why are they doing this? Jesus says, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? So he goes 1,000 years back into the history of Israel and speaks of an incident in the life of David, the king of Israel. So these all-knowing Pharisees perhaps were unaware of this episode in the life of David. Well, maybe they were very dim in their memory of it, or maybe had just chosen willfully to forget all about it because it stood in opposition to what they were promoting. We read about it in 1 Samuel chapter 21. David did have this incident in his life. He's on the run from Saul, and David goes to the priest and asks for the showbread, or the bread of presence. Now, this is the week-old showbread that was used there in the tabernacle. David asks the priest if he could have some. His companions and he were very hungry. This showbread, this bread of presence, 12 loaves there were on the table in the holy place, representing all 12 tribes of ancient Israel. It truly was symbolizing the constant fellowship that they had with God. These loaves were changed every Sabbath. Only priests, yes, only the priests were to eat the showbread. But David was not condemned for his action, going to the priest and saying, look, it's a week old. I know it's really only for you guys, but I and my companions are so hungry. Shall we be able to eat? And they were allowed to eat. Now listen, Jesus does not claim that David did not actually break the finer technicalities of the tabernacle law, but here is what Jesus shows us. He shows us that human necessity is a higher law than religious ritualism. That's what he's saying. There's something about human necessity. There was an absolute necessity that David and his men be fed. Now, there was something supposedly that would prevent them from eating this bread, but Jesus is using this example to promote human necessity over and above legalistic type of ritualism, especially on the Sabbath. So the conclusion would be that the true necessities of human life far outweigh the laws of the Sabbath, especially Pharisaical amendments to God's law. So Jesus is first making this point. Listen, life is life, might I paraphrase. Life is life. Those walking with me are hungry and there's grain, and they want simply a handful or two of grain, like David's men wanted a piece of a loaf of week-old bread. So don't be coming down with your legalism when the necessity of life is at hand. I've never lived far enough north anywhere in this country where any kind of pond, lake, or anything ever froze over. Never been there, never seen it, never experienced it, but I know people that are from places like Minnesota and Wisconsin and places like that where ponds and rivers even freeze over. Well, I read this story years ago. I share it with you this morning. A pastor discovered one Sunday morning that the roads were blocked with heavy snow. And the only way that he could reach church to do his ministerial duties that Lord's Day morning was to skate on the frozen river. So he put his ice skates on, and down the river he went to the church. When he arrived, the elders of the church were horrified that their preacher should skate on the Sabbath. After the service, they had a meeting, and he explained that it was either to skate or to not get there. Well, finally, one of the elders asked, "Did you enjoy it?" When the pastor said, "No, I didn't enjoy it," they decided, well, that's all right, as long as you didn't enjoy it. Great. The necessity. I'm not going to be able to be at the church and preach if I don't skate. And that's what Jesus is saying. Let me tell you about this. The necessities of life trump sometimes even the laws that pertain to what you do on the Sabbath. The second issue has to do with works of mercy versus Sabbath ritual. Into the third chapter, the first 6 verses, Jesus does another healing. But according to the Pharisees, as wonderful of a work of mercy it is, it can't be good because you did it on the wrong day. There's a Sabbath day controversy, and Jesus has entered the synagogue on the Sabbath. Perhaps preach and minister. We don't know the details of exactly what he did, but he is confronted by a man that is handicapped, has a withered arm. The Pharisees, they're there and they're watching. By this time in Jesus' ministry, They are looking at Jesus at all points in his ministry. They're scoping him out. They're wanting to see what they can hear and understand from his ministry. They're not there to worship God that day at the synagogue. They're there to spy on Jesus, I believe. They were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, it says. They wanted to convict Jesus of breaking God's law concerning the healing of a man on the Sabbath, just like they wanted to be successful concerning the grain issue. And the charge that they bring is unnecessarily practicing medicinal therapy on the Sabbath. That's what they're saying. They want to prosecute that case. I believe they think that maybe they have a lock case, a locked up, very tightly case. Well, we got him now. He's practicing healing therapy on the Sabbath. Because listen, not only had the Pharisees developed 39 additional commandments to add to the Sabbath, they had done the same with healing. And they said you could only heal a man on the Sabbath who was in danger of dying. That's what they said. Only in danger of dying. This man wasn't in danger of dying, but he certainly had a pretty serious handicap. Well, the issue is simply doing good. That's what this is all about, doing good in relationship to what you do on the Sabbath. So Jesus asked them this question. And I know I've said this many times since we've been in the book of Mark. When you ask Jesus questions, oftentimes he does what? He asks you a question. And it's usually not the kind of question that you are prepared at all to deal with. And what does Jesus ask? Well, you tell me, Mr. Pharisee, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? Which of those is lawful? To save life or to kill? Pharisees, they were experts in the law. They know all that was permitted. They know all that was lawful. They knew all that was right. They knew these things. Is it right to do good on the Sabbath? What was the only legitimate answer they could give? Of course, they had to agree. Yes, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. We are told this by the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 6 about doing good. Let us, Paul says, not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So is it right to do good? Yes, it's right. Is it right to do evil and kill? Well, never is that allowed by God. The Pharisees, though, were involved in just this very practice of evil and murder in the spiritual realm. We know Jesus taught in his Sermon on the Mount about spiritual murder. If you say in your heart, you fool, I would rather you not live, I'd rather you be gone, that kind of rancor Jesus equated with spiritual murder in the heart. That's what these men, these Pharisees are saying. They're looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They want to somehow trip him up. And Jesus gets what kind of response from them? Crickets. Crickets. They remain silent. The master teacher has once again trapped them in their own web. They did not want to say that doing good by helping this man was evil for fear of the obvious contradiction in the sight of the people. They would have looked stupid in that synagogue that day to say this good healing by Jesus of Nazareth is wicked and evil. The people would have said, I've had enough of your stuff. They were not going to go there, so they just became quiet. But not so with Jesus. It is said of Jesus in numbers of times in these gospel accounts how he felt emotionally. And we are told that Jesus becomes angry and distressed at these Pharisees and what they're doing concerning good works of mercy on the Sabbath. In the word angry in the word Greek is best understood as righteous indignation. angry because there's something that is wrong. The Pharisees, they had murder in their hearts, and that angered Jesus. It says Jesus was distressed. This would be better understood as sympathy for moral misfortune, and that Jesus had a heart of compassion, even for the Pharisees. He was distressed because these so-called teachers of the law were so immoral, but yet that touched the heart of Jesus. You see, their hearts were hard and their hearts were stubborn. And Jesus tells us in Matthew 23 his understanding of the people that he ministered among, including these Pharisees. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." So Jesus is angry and he's distressed. And there is this reaction of the Pharisees in verse 6. They leave. They figure, we've had enough of this. We tried twice. We struck out twice. He put us in our place. And so it says they join with the Herodians, a group of politically minded elite who were loyal to Herod Antipas as the king of the Jews at the time. And they understood that Jesus was a threat to their power structure. And now the Pharisees are running, hat in hand, having been whooped by Jesus. And they're saying, "Can you help us? We want to join with you if you have not yet hatched a plot to get rid of this menace, Jesus of Nazareth. We must find a way to kill this guy." And so in Mark's copy of the gospel, the plot is hatched early on. We're going to get rid of Jesus, for traditionalism had suffered a humiliating defeat. Because you see, genuine mercy toward those in need supersedes the ritual law of the Sabbath. It does. It does. And Jesus makes it painfully clear. We all remember the wonderful movie Forrest Gump, don't we? Forrest Gump. One of the great movies of all time. Now, Forrest, we know, was an interesting character, wasn't he? From Greenbow, Alabama. I think they're making a little fun of Alabama by doing that. I don't know. But we know that he went to Vietnam. And he found himself there fighting in the Vietnam War under the command of Lieutenant Dan with his best friend Bubba. You'll recall that scene, right? A firefight breaks out. And Bubba is severely wounded. And Lieutenant Dan is severely wounded. And Bubba is essentially dying on the battlefield. Lieutenant Dan tells Forrest, "Do not go back and get Bubba." He says, "I have to, Lieutenant Dan. I have to save Bubba." And he did. And then Lieutenant Dan, dying there in the jungles of South Vietnam, says directly to the man under his command, "You shall not remove my body and take it away. I want to die here like my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather." And what did Bubba find Forrest doing? And what did Lieutenant Dan find Forrest doing? Disobeying. Say, "No, I'm getting Bubba out of there. I'm getting Lieutenant Dan out of there. I don't care what the rules and the protocol of the United States Army are right now. I'm going to save them." You see, there's a time for mercy over law. Mercy maybe even over the commands of an officer in the military. And Jesus is making that patently clear. But here's what I really want to stress to you this morning. It has to do with the whole purpose of the Sabbath, over and against Sabbath ritual. Verses 27 and 28 of the second chapter. The question really before us this morning is, who was the Sabbath made for? What is the big deal with this Sabbath thing, with God and all these commandments about it, and now Jesus giving all this teaching about it? Well, Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man. And it is so important that we get the horse and the cart in the right order here. The Sabbath was made for man. Jesus says, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is to serve man. Man was created first, and then God rested. Man was created and then told to worship God and to find their pleasure in God and follow the example of God the Creator, and on the seventh day to rest. It was to be a blessing for all. We are not to see ourselves as servants of the Sabbath. That leads in a large part to things like ritualism and legalism. You see, any and all biblical parameters of behavior on the Sabbath are for, listen, our own good. For our own good. The Pharisees wanted men to serve their Sabbath restrictions. But the Sabbath was never intended to restrict man from worshiping and serving God through good works. It never was, and it never will be. And Jesus says that He is the Lord of the Sabbath. That He is the Lord of all. Jesus alone judges what is good for man on the Sabbath, and I think He's given us plenty to think about what is good for us to be involved in on the Sabbath. Because Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath gives His 100% approval for performing what? Necessities of life, works of mercy on the Sabbath. Jesus stands against restrictive legalism, against ritualism, with the conclusion essentially being, if it is truly for the good and spiritual edification of yourself, of your fellow man, it is permissible to tend to those necessary works of goodness and mercy on the Sabbath day. It's all right. It's all right. It's really a matter of who's serving who. I recall when I was a youngster living in Louisiana, I had a good friend who got a job walking a gigantic dog that was owned by one of the neighbors. It was an Afghan hound. It's really one of the biggest dogs I've ever been around in my life. And my friend, who was 8 years old like I was, would try to walk this Afghan hound. And he would grab the leash and start heading across the neighborhood. And I mean, he was just being pulled through the neighborhood by the Afghan hound. It was really a matter of who was walking who. Who was walking who? That's the point that Jesus is really making. Let us walk the Sabbath and see how God has designed it for our own benefit. Not let the Sabbath and unbiblical views of the Sabbath drag us in to legalism and ritualism. So we must let the Sabbath serve us. Let me ask some questions as we close. Do we view Sunday as a day to rest and worship God? Or as a day in which a couple of hours in the morning are occupied at the church building? That's a compelling question. What do we think of Sunday? Even what we're doing coming here on a Sunday morning like today. Secondly, are we taking opportunity of this entire Sabbath day to fellowship with the Lord and His people, viewing it as the total day? And thirdly, I would say this: we should view the Sabbath as an opportunity to be renewed in our zeal for God and strengthened to do good works throughout the week. There is benefit to what we do on Sunday as it would impact the things we do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the whole rest of the week to come. So I say the key application of this entire teaching scenario with Jesus, the Pharisees, the accusations about the Sabbath, and so on, is simply this, and I'll leave this with you. The Sabbath was instituted to serve the people of God and to assist us in knowing and serving God in a more complete manner. That's why we have it, and it would do our soul good to take it very seriously, what God says to us about the blessing of the Sabbath. Let's pray. Father, again, we are amazed and ever thankful for the teaching of your Son, Jesus Christ. He said to Pontius Pilate, just a couple of hours before he would be tried and convicted for false crimes, he said to Pontius Pilate, I have come into this world, Pontius, to testify to the truth. And Jesus, you have taught us the unadulterated truth about the Sabbath, that our souls might understand the blessing of this day and what you would have us to do and how we should set it aside as a sacred day to our benefit, because As you said, Jesus, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please stand and turn in your hymnals to number 585. We'll sing